Okay, so officially welcome to this class, 5 ways you can make your glazes more amazing using glaze chemistry. So I'm Sue McLeod. I'll just introduce myself quickly. I first got started in ceramics at Kootenai School of the Arts. That's in Nelson, British Columbia. So I live on Vancouver Island. I live in Souk, which is just outside of Victoria, British Columbia. And so I did a 2-year clay diploma program. That was my first, that's where I first learned to throw on the wheel. And that's where I first learned glaze mixing in my second year at KSA, as we call it. I've had a home pottery studio since I graduated, so I've always had my own kiln and wheel, and so all that time I've had a home studio. I've been studying glaze chemistry intensively since 2014, and so I took 3 courses through Alfred University. They were called Glazes 1, Glazes 2, and clay bodies class with Matt Katz. He was the teacher. So that's the first class I took was in 2014. And that's what I was just hooked. I already loved glazes before I actually started learning about the chemistry. And once I started learning chemistry, I just kind of became obsessed with the UMF and just analyzing glaze recipes. And so that's why I'm now teaching about it, because I've just immersed myself in glazes. It's my favorite aspect of ceramics. It's also the most difficult and challenging, and I think that is part of the draw as well. So I did some research on cone 6 glazes, and I presented that research at the NCECA conference. So that's a conference that happens every year in the United States in a different city. So it was 2018 in Pittsburgh, where I presented my research on cone 6 glazes and the stall chart and the UMF, which I'll be introducing you to a little bit today. Then I also worked as a ceramic studio technician for 6 years at a public pottery studio here in Victoria called Cedar Hill. It's a rec center. So I was the technician there for 6 years, and I quit my job in 2021 to teach full-time. So now I just work from home in my home studio, and I teach online classes. And I've fired literally thousands of glaze tests. So even before I learned about glaze chemistry, I was always testing glazes, and I was always putting test tiles in the kiln just to see what would happen, and always trying to see if I could change glazes and get them working better and test new glazes with different colorants and all of that. Okay, so if you're ready to start, please turn off your phones, close other tabs, and get rid of any distractions. I'm going to cover a lot of things today. Grab a pen and a notebook, because you'll want to take notes as we go. And again, just a reminder, the chat window, you guys can use the chat to talk amongst yourselves during this presentation. I will not be watching the chat. So if you have questions about what I'm teaching that you want to submit for the Q&A at the end, I'm going to answer as many questions as I possibly can before noon Pacific time. So this will be 2 hours long, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you want to submit questions for me to answer at the end. So a question to you: have you ever put your heart and soul into making a piece only to have it ruined by the glazing process? And if you're anything like me, this has happened more than once. Like, you spend all this time learning throwing skills and building, hand building, however you work with clay. We often all of our focus goes into getting really good at that skill, and then glazing is often seen as an afterthought. So you spend all this time making this beautiful creation, and then you put a glaze on it and it comes out the kiln and you're just disappointed. So this has happened to me so much, and I know that it happens to a lot of people, because glazes, there's just so many factors that go into what your glaze will look like at the end of the firing, that it's just really hard to control. Sometimes, controlling application thickness, controlling kiln temperature, firing schedules, all of these things, cooling cycles, all of these things contribute to how your glaze turns out when you unload the kiln. And it's really easy to not get it right the first few times. So if that has happened to you, then I hear you. I've definitely been there, and it still happens to me. Like, I think a glaze is going to turn out a certain way and it doesn't. And so we really have to embrace glaze testing if we want to really understand glazes. Okay, so does this sound like you? You wish you could just glaze your pots and have them turn out the way you expect. So you have this vision in your mind, and then you go to do the glazing process, and you just wish, like, if you were painting a picture, you pretty much know what you're going to get. You're there for the entire painting process. But with ceramics, we put our stuff in the kiln, and then we're kind of hands off for a while, and all this chemistry happens in the kiln. And then we're left with whatever comes out on the other side. And it's oftentimes not what we had hoped or what we had expected. Or you, in the interest of learning more about glazes, you've read books and Googled and watched YouTube videos, but they all still seem like a mystery. There's always some missing piece that you're not quite getting. That was me also before I started learning about glaze chemistry. Or you want kiln openings to be exciting and inspiring and make you feel good about yourself and your pots and your work, instead of just being frustrated and disappointed every time you unload the kiln. So, I can relate to all of this. This all comes from my personal experience, and my struggles with glazes are what launched me into the world of learning about glaze chemistry. I was just like, I have to figure this out. It's just so frustrating not knowing what's happening inside the kiln. So here is an overview of what I'm going to cover in today's class. So 5 ways you can make your glazes more amazing. Number 1 is material substitutions. So I'm going to show you how material substitutions can help you create recipes that you don't have all the ingredients for, like maybe Gersley borate or lithium carb or Frit 3124 or 3134, whichever one. Our materials are constantly going away, and we have to learn how to adapt when mines shut down and things aren't available. There's a pandemic and things can't get shipped around the world anymore. So when you understand how to do material substitutions, you can basically recreate a glaze, using other types of materials and recreate the same chemistry that you would have. And so it's a really good skill to have. And it can help you improve glaze performance and even reduce costs. So you could recreate a glaze that uses expensive materials like Fritz or Gersley borate now, or now Fritz are less expensive than Gersley borate all of a sudden. So that's a really good skill to have. Glaze colors. So I'm going to show you how each colorant can turn out different depending on the base recipe. So, we might think about cobalt makes blue glazes, but what about when it makes green glazes? So I'm going to show you lots of different examples of different results that you can get with the different colorants, which are dependent on the base recipe that the colorant goes into. So copper can turn out blue or green or somewhere in the middle. It all depends on the chemistry of the base recipe. Matte versus glossy surfaces. Which materials are responsible for whether your glaze will be matte or glossy? Most people, there's lots of glossy glazes out there. Most people are trying to find a good matte glaze. That's what I have found. People are always asking me. I have a blog post called How to Turn Your Matte Glaze Glossy. And whenever I share that, I get a lot of emails back to me, but how do I turn my glossy glaze matte? And it's a very simple relationship between silica and alumina. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Melting temperature. So if you've ever had your glazes run all over the kiln shelf, or maybe your glaze, you might be working with a glaze that's underfired. So an overfired glaze will start running. An underfired glaze, you might have a matte glaze that's actually an underfired glossy glaze. Or you might just want to adjust. You might want to make your glaze a little more fluid. And all of that is to do with the glaze's melting temperature and how we can adjust melting temperature using chemistry. And then, of course, crazing. This is always a big topic. Is like, why did my glaze craze? Is it because I opened the kiln too early? Spoiler alert, it's not because you opened your kiln too early. It's a relationship between the chemistry of your glaze and the chemistry of your clay body. It's called glaze fit, and it's related to thermal expansion. As our clay and glazes are heated and then cooled, everything expands and contracts. And if they don't do that at the same rate, then we have glaze fit issues, which can lead to crazing. If you don't know what crazing is, I'll have examples, but it's where your glaze crackles and you hear those pings when you open the kiln. Okay, let me just have a sip of water. So as I was saying at the beginning, I can't possibly teach you everything I know about chemistry today. So I'm going to try to give you lots of information, but you will still have questions at the end of this class. So just to keep that in mind, it doesn't mean you're not getting it. It just means that I can't possibly tell you everything to give you the whole picture. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to tell you about my course, The Art of Glaze Chemistry, where I do teach you everything I possibly know. And so just know that this is just a little taste of what you can do when you understand chemistry. But if you want to take it further, if you find you're very interested in learning about glaze chemistry on a much deeper level, then I'm going to tell you all about my course, The Art of Glaze Chemistry, registration open today. So at the end of the teaching portion of this, I will talk about that course. So before we dig in, I'm just going to quickly share my story with you about how I got here and why I learned all of this stuff. So 9 years ago, it was fall of 2014. I unloaded my kiln to find all of my mugs were cracked with the bottoms popped off. So very sad face. It was, leading into Christmas holiday markets. I had paid a lot of money to be in a few different markets, one in Vancouver, Circle Craft, and there's the Out of Hand show in Victoria. So I had all these markets lined up, and then I opened the kiln and literally all of my mugs, the bottoms had popped off. And I'm like, how much longer can I had worked so hard to try to get this brown glaze to stop running onto my kiln shelves. I finally figured that out. I would put a clear glaze at the bottom to kind of catch the drips. But then I learned that the clear glaze was the thermal expansion issues between the clear glaze and the glaze on the inside, they didn't match. And so all my pots were broken. And then same year, fall of 2014, I unloaded another kiln load. So I spent hours and hours and hours making these 5 teapots that look like this. And I drew them before I made them. They looked exactly how I wanted them to look. I was so proud of them. And I was so careful when I glazed them, I thought. And then 4 out of 5 ran onto the kiln shelf. There was dunting. So dunting is when your clay cracks because the thermal expansion relationship between your glazes, they're kind of like pulling against each other and creating a lot of tension. And sometimes it's enough tension that it can actually crack your pots. So they were all stuck to the kiln shelf. Some of them, even if I could grind the drips off, which I couldn't, the tops were cracked as well. So another sad face. Here's another one of those teapots. So 5 ruined teapots, hours and hours of work out the window. So if you've ever unloaded a kiln and you're just not happy with anything in there, like all that time that you spent creating those pieces, you know, it's just gone. Like you can't get that time back. You can learn a lot. You can, you know, every failed kiln load is a learning experience, but if you don't understand what went wrong, you don't really know what you can do to fix it either. So that's kind of where I was at. I was mad and frustrated. There's me with my respirator on. I considered myself a professional potter, but I was feeling very much like an amateur, like I didn't know what I was doing. I was very sad. You know, I didn't know what to do next. I was like, I live on an island. There isn't a university here that has a ceramics master's program. Like, if I wanted to go back to school, I was going to have to move to another part of the country, move to a different country. So I didn't really know what I could possibly do. I just felt very stuck. But then there was hope. And it was like right at that time that Alfred University decided to start offering its courses online. And so I signed up right away. I was like, thank you. Like, you know, all my troubles have been answered with this course. I didn't have to go anywhere. It was held over the Christmas break, called the Allen term at Alfred University. And so I was, you know, I just immersed myself in that course. It was online. I only had access to the course for 5 weeks, but I just watched those videos over and over and over and over and took a million notes, and really drilled the information into my brain. So I took 3 online courses through Alfred, studied hard, tested everything I was learning. So not only did I take the course, but I did all of the assignments, and that is the key. Information is just theory in your brain until you actually put glazes on pots, put them in the kiln, and see what comes out on the other side. So if any of you are interested in signing up for my class, The Art of Glaze Chemistry, there will be glaze testing assignments. And I just want to emphasize the importance of doing the tests, because that's where the learning happens, is opening the kiln and seeing what happens on the other side of the firing. So thousands of test tiles later, I just went on a glaze testing spree. I had already been on a testing spree, but until then, all I knew what to do, like all I knew was how to change colorants for each other, doing color runs. So anytime I tested a new glaze that I would find in a book or a magazine, lazy.org didn't exist back then, I would always test the base with different colorants to see what my options were with that particular glaze. So I now have the knowledge, experience, and confidence to solve any problem, maybe not immediately, but I know how. I know the steps to solve any sort of glaze problem with enough testing. So I don't want you to think that there's a magic answer for any sort of glaze problem, but all you really need to know is what to test. And then you get closer, and then you test again, and then you get closer, and then you test again. And so as long as you don't give up testing, and every test that comes out of the kiln, you're learning something, you're analyzing your results, and you're taking that information and then you're testing again. So that's the process to really, really having an intimate understanding with your glaze materials, the relationship between your glazes and your clay body. So I used glaze chemistry to create this bright green glossy glaze, this matte glaze with pink speckles. I made all these lichen glazes of various surfaces and patterns. I created a clear glaze that doesn't craze, and then a velvety matte black glaze that's not underfired. More on that later. So yeah, so it's quite common that a matte glaze, you know, not all the time, but a lot of matte glazes out there are just underfired glossy glazes. And a glaze when you put a glaze in the kiln, it starts as just powdered materials. Then they it's called sintering. They glue themselves together. And if you turn the kiln off before they start melting, you have a matte glaze. Like it'll appear like a matte glaze. It's stuck to your pots, but it hasn't quite completed the melting process. A matte glaze is a glaze that has melted and then crystallized, producing a matte surface. So I've been teaching glaze chemistry classes and workshops in person and online since 2017. So this is my very first glaze chemistry workshop that was in a fellow potter's living room, a bunch of people at the rec center. I always was teaching people on the side. People would come to me with glaze questions and I would answer them, and they're like, you should teach a class. And so we had this very first class in someone's living room. It was 2 hours long. I tried to teach everything I knew about chemistry in 2 hours. And now this first class has turned into an 8-module course known as the Art of Glaze Chemistry. So that's kind of my evolution. Some words from my student, May. She says, I'm not a science nut, so the thought of chemistry was somewhat intimidating. Knowing I could apply it to real life practices was the nudge I needed. I'm over the moon with all the information I have gained. Thank you for such a well thought out program. I'm more confident and excited to execute what I've learned, both successes and experiments to learn from. And then she had posted again, this is an amazing opportunity not to be missed. The course was thorough and enjoyable. Sue is an excellent teacher who will inspire you to reach beyond what you think you're capable of. So that's very nice. Little testimonial from May, one of my Art of Glaze Chemistry students. So imagine that feeling of opening the kiln to feel joy and a sense of accomplishment instead of more disappointment and frustration. That's what we all want, right? We want this happy face, not a sad face when we're unloading the kiln. So where do we start? We'll start with another sip of water. So here we have the periodic table of the elements. This is a revised version that I created just to highlight the main components of our base glaze recipes. So, so I kind of grayed out everything else. And these are, oxygen is kind of bonded with everything, but we have 11 elements that are the basis for almost every glaze recipe. So first we have the glass formers, which are silica, alumina, and boron. Silicon, aluminum, and boron are the names of the elements, but they all come to us in an oxide form. So silicon dioxide, SiO2, becomes, we call that silica, and aluminum oxide, Al2O3, we call it alumina. And then boron, I just call boron. It's like boric oxide, but I just refer to it as boron. So those are our glass formers, and our glass formers are the materials that melt into a glass in the kiln. Silica is our primary glass former, meaning that the majority of what our glazes are composed of is silica. And then everything else is added to the silica in order to either help the glaze to melt at the temperature that we're firing it to, or to prevent the glaze from running onto the kiln shelf, which we use fluxes lower the melting temperature of silica. So silica all by itself melts at a very high temperature. It's around cone 32. And so if you think of our cones, our witness cones, a lot of us are firing to cone 6 or cone 10, maybe cone 12 at the most. Silica by itself melts at cone 32. So how do we lower the melting temperature of silica? We do that by adding fluxes. And fluxes can be divided into two groups. The primary fluxes are referred to as the R2O. That's just like That's just shorthand for the R can represent any element that takes this, this format. So all of the primary fluxes are in the first column of the periodic table: lithium, sodium, and potassium. The secondary fluxes, the RO, so it's one element bonded with one oxygen, so magnesium, calcium, strontium, barium, and then also zinc, which is over here. So these all fall in the same column. Zinc is over to the right. There's always anomalies and special cases in ceramics. So the primary fluxes are the really active melters. They are what get the melting started as the kiln temperature goes up. The secondary fluxes are also melters, but they kind of keep the melting under control, and they're not as powerful as the primary fluxes. If we were to use all primary flux and no secondary flux, the glaze would just start melting, and before we knew it, it would be running all over the kiln shelf. So we add secondary fluxes to kind of control the melting so it doesn't happen so fast. And then boron, or I didn't talk about alumina, is the material that prevents the glaze from running onto the kiln shelf. It can be called a stiffener. What it does is it increases the melted viscosity of the glaze. So viscosity refers to the physical thickness of a liquid. So when our glazes melt in the kiln, the liquid that they form, it can either be thick, high viscosity, or very thin like water, low viscosity, and that's when you get running. So the more alumina you have in your glaze, the higher the melted viscosity during the firing, and the less chance your glaze is going to run. So we kind of have to balance out the fluxes, which lower the melting temperature, the alumina that kind of brings it back up again. And then boron is also a glass former, but it melts at a much lower temperature than silica and alumina. And it is often used in glazes that melts below cone 10. So cone 6, cone 04, earthenware, mid-temperature stonewares, all of those temperatures below cone 10 require a little bit of boron just to get them melting. And boron is a glass former that kind of acts like a flux. So there's the periodic table intro to chemistry. And so here we go again. One thing when you're learning glaze chemistry to keep in mind is that the glaze recipe is a whole, like it's a whole pie. And so when you increase one ingredient or element, you're effectively reducing the other elements proportionately. So everything is about proportions to each other. So we have the proportions of our fluxes to our glass formers. We have the proportions of the primary fluxes to the secondary fluxes. We have proportions of silica to alumina. I'm going to talk more about that when we talk about matte and glossy. But just know that, if we have a glaze recipe and someone tells us to add silica to it, so silica is the yellow section. When we add silica to it, the silica section gets bigger and everything else gets a little bit smaller. And that's just, it's a foundational concept that you just want to keep in mind, because that's kind of how the chemistry works. It's all about the proportions of this molecule to that molecule. And however many molecules of silica we have compared to alumina, for example, is going to determine whether the glaze will be matte or glossy. So I'll get back to more about that in a second. So let's start talking about material substitutions. So material substitutions, meaning we have this glaze recipe in front of us, and it has a list of materials that we need to weigh out into a bucket and mix together. But what happens when someone shares a recipe with you, like this great new glaze recipe, and you don't have all of the materials in that recipe? We can oftentimes, not every material has a substitute, but we can oftentimes remove one material and then add different materials so that the chemistry of the new recipe matches the chemistry of the old recipe. And as long as the chemistry of the two glaze recipes match, it doesn't really matter what materials are used. Once everything is melted in the kiln, chemistry just takes place. And the chemistry doesn't care whether the sodium came from nepheline cyanide or minspar or some other form of sodium. The chemistry just cares about the proportions of all of these molecules in the liquid glaze, and that's what determines the melting temperature and the surface, whether it'll be matte or glossy, the color and everything like that. So we can use material substitutions to either recreate glaze recipes where we don't have all the materials, or we can just make adjustments to reduce costs. So we can replace an expensive material with a not so expensive material, improving glaze performance. So sometimes clay or kaolin is one of our main sources of alumina. You can also get kaolin, or you can also get alumina from feldspars, from frits. And so depending on which materials you combine together, it'll determine kind of how your glaze stays suspended in the bucket, how the glaze applies to your pots. And so sometimes, like if we have a glaze that's really low in clay, we might get hard panning. So we could increase the clay content of a glaze, and then we would have to reduce, the alumina that we're bringing in with clay or kaolin. We would have to reduce that by reducing one of the other materials. And so it's a bit of a dance, like you increase one thing and you lower something else, and then something else goes up. And so you're always just trying to get the chemistry of the two glazes to match in the end. And then the chemistry in the kiln will be the same. So here's the anatomy of a glaze recipe. We've got a recipe with materials and percentages. So this is my clear glaze. A lot of you have probably tried it out. I know lots of people have tested it. Everyone's always on the hunt for a great clear glaze that works well on their clay body. So we have the recipe with percentages that add up to 100. And then if you use glazy.org, which is a glaze recipe sharing site, you can search for new recipes. But it gives you the chemistry, which is called the UMF, the Unity Molecular Formula. And so you may have seen this before and wondered what it all means, but this is everything. So this is what determines what's going to happen inside the kiln, way more than my material choices in the recipe. So just keeping that in mind, the UMF, the Unity Molecular Formula, you can see our fluxes are here, R2O and RO fluxes, and then alumina, silica, and boron are glass formers. And so that's everything that we need to know. We've got our relationship, our proportions of silica to alumina. We've got our proportions of primary flux to secondary flux here. So this is what when someone sends me a glaze recipe and they're having trouble with it, this is almost always what I look at first. I do like to see, the percentages of the clay, but generally this is the most important part as far as how the glaze is going to melt and the results at the end of the firing. So, I already kind of did this, but again, we got fluxes here and then glass formers here. So that is what's known as the UMF, the Unity Molecular Formula. Some people call it the Seeger formula because it was developed by a scientist. I think his name's Hermann Seeger. So yeah, you might hear it referred to in both of those ways. So here's an example of, we've got Suze Clear here that I just showed you. These are two, it's the same clear glaze. So the chemistry of these three glazes match, but in this one, so the recipe that we use at Cedar Hill has two frits. We've got frit 3124, frit 3134. This one, it is like, okay, if you don't have access to 3134, we can make this glaze using only frit 3124. And then this one is just using only 3134. So all of these recipes are different, but the chemistry is the same. So you can see the flux ratios are the same. the boron level, the alumina level, the silica, everything is the same. And so therefore I could use either of these versions of this glaze and I would expect to get the same results. So when you don't have a material in a recipe, the question that often gets asked is, what material can I substitute for X? So people right now, there's Gersley borate has astronomically gone up in price, and everyone's like, okay, what's a substitute for Gersley borate? And that's not really the best way to think about material substitutions, because if we had an identical material to Gersley borate, it would just be Gersley borate. Every material has a slightly different composition, but they can contain the same elements. And so Gersley borate is a source of boron. That's generally why we're adding Gersley borate to a glaze, is because it contains boron that we need to get our glaze melting. So the better question to ask is like, what other materials could I add to my recipe that contain boron? And that's the way to approach material substitutions, is when you remove a material, what goes down, which elements go down, and then what material can you add to bring those elements back up again? So the right question to ask is, which elements am I replacing? What's another material or combination of materials, which is most often the case, that will provide those elements? The simplest example is we can replace wollastonite, which is calcium silicate, with whiting and silica. Whiting provides the calcium, silica provides the silicate. So whiting plus silica, you can add whiting and silica to replace wollastonite. So that's a very simple example. I'm going to do a more complicated example for you today, just to show you how I would go about adjusting my clear recipe if I didn't have Frit 3124. So we start, and I'm going to go pretty fast here, but just know you can go back and rewatch this when you get the link to the replay. So this is the original recipe. And so I'm saying I don't have access to 3124. So I'm in glazy.org here. I pull up the recipe in the calculator, and then I just remove 3124. And so what I'm looking for in the UMF is I'm always looking for which elements went down. So I've just highlighted the boron went down. So some things go up, but I'm always looking at what went down. So the boron went down and the primary flux went down a little bit. So B2O3 goes down, R2O goes down. So the next step is, okay, what can I increase to increase the boron? So I'm starting with the one, boron went down the most, so I'm going to increase the boron first. And I know you have to have an idea of what all your materials are composed of in order to know what you're going to increase. So it's going to take a little bit of getting to know, like, Minspar is sodium feldspar. It contains sodium, silica, and alumina. This is just going to take practice and just studying your material compositions in order to know, like, what materials can I add to increase boron. So I know that if I increase Frit 3134, that will bring my boron level up. It also adjusts, 3134 has boron. It also has sodium, calcium, and silica, but I'm right now just concerned with the boron. So I increased the Frit from 9 to 17% just until the boron level matches. So now, in doing that, all of my fluxes match. That was just happy accident. The fluxes match, the boron matches. So now I move on to, okay, what else has gone down? We've got the alumina has gone down. So it's 0.46 here, 0.43, and the silica has also gone down. So I'm going to say, okay, what do I need to increase the alumina? I always leave silica for last because silica is one of the only materials where you can just add straight up silica. Alumina, I have to add clay, which contains both silica and alumina. So in order to increase the alumina level to 0.46 to get these numbers to match, I'm going to increase my clay content. So I went up just a couple percent, and now the alumina level matches, the boron still matches, the fluxes still match. So now I'm left with the silica. I just need a little tiny bit of silica to bring this number up to match this one. And so I can just increase the silica by 1.1%. And now the whole UMF matches. So now I have a new recipe that the chemistry of the glaze matches the original. And now I can make this glaze. You can see Frit 3124 is at 0%. And now I have a glaze that is just with Frit 3134. So that is essentially how material substitutions work. I gave you the most complex example just so you can kind of see that sometimes it's very simple, but sometimes it's a little more complicated. And so I hope you take away from this that it's a good idea to just start learning, what is whiting composed of? Whiting is calcium carbonate. What is wollastonite? Calcium silicate that I already said. So it's a good idea to get to know what your materials are made of. So just to recap, we use material substitutions to recreate glaze recipes with materials we have access to. We can improve glaze performance, and we can reduce costs by replacing expensive materials with less than expensive materials. So in the Art of Glaze Chemistry, if you join, you'll get an entire module on material substitutions, including my handy order of operations. So I always start with the boron. I always end with the silica. So I explain all of that, why I would, why I start with boron. I always start with the complex materials and work my way to the more simple materials. Otherwise, things are going up and then down, and sometimes you can't get to where you want. So order of operations is really handy. And you'll get very familiar with all of the common materials and their compositions, so you know which materials can be used to substitute for what. You'll also learn how to find the composition of any materials that you come across. So you'll learn how to learn what your materials are composed of. And then this is just a quote from Joan, one of my AGC students. She says, "I love learning everything. I enjoyed adjusting recipes on Glaze. I had fun doing material substitutions for materials that I don't have. It is awesome to realize that I can make glazes with the materials I already have without needing to buy new ingredients for the most part. I just have to be careful with my secondary fluxes, opacifiers, and colorants so I can get the colors that I want." All right, moving on to number 2, glaze color response. So the color response, so the color that a colorant will turn your glaze, is determined by the colorant that you choose, the concentration of the colorant, so what percentage of that colorant do you add to the glaze, and then the chemistry of the base glaze that you're adding the colorant to. So here's the part of the periodic table where all of our colorants, they all fall in a nice horizontal line right in the center. They're called the transition metals. We've got vanadium, which isn't very common colorant, but it makes yellows, chrome, manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, and copper. So here's an example of this. These are all the same base glaze with different colorants added. So we've got chrome, iron, nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. So this is where we're changing the color. The base glaze stays the same, but we can add different colorants to the base glaze, and we can create a bunch of compatible glazes of different colors because they all have the same base glaze. This is an example of the same base glaze, but one colorant, different concentrations of one colorant. So these are all the same base glaze, but they have different percentages of iron. So you can see 0.5%, 1, 3, 5, and 10% iron. You can get anywhere from yellow to orange in this particular glaze. when you increase the percentage of iron. So that's increasing the concentration of the colorant is another way to change the colors of your glazes. Now, these are all different base glazes, but with the same concentrations of colorants above and below each other. So these two are the same base glaze with 1% cobalt, 1% copper. These two are the same base glaze. Again, all of these have 1% cobalt and all of these have 1% copper. So you can see, depending on the base glaze that you add your 1% of cobalt or copper to, you can get very different results. And that's based on the chemistry of the base glaze. The chemistry of the base determines the color that your colorant will become. So cobalt, we can get anywhere from blue, powder blue, we can get purples, we can get greens. With copper, it's usually somewhere between blue and green and a bunch of turquoises in between. This one's kind of gray. That's, there's a bunch of titanium in this glaze. So it all depends on the chemistry of the base glaze, what color that colorant will become. Now, here's an example. This is from the Art of Glaze Chemistry course. Same base glaze, same colorant, but different secondary fluxes. So just a reminder, the secondary fluxes are magnesium, calcium, strontium, barium, and zinc. So we've got all of these are cobalt, same base glaze, but this one is using magnesium as the secondary flux. And I use material substitutions to replace one flux for another. So it totally changes the chemistry. So calcium is these two, strontium is these two, barium, and then zinc. So you can see another range of colors that you can get from one colorant, depending on the chemistry of the base glaze that you add it to. A common misconception is that cobalt only makes blue. But as you can see, cobalt sometimes will make green. Sometimes you'll get blue with where it breaks green, like our sapphire blue glaze is mostly blue, but where it's thin, it's green. That is often the result of titanium in the recipe. And then here's an example of where cobalt makes purple, lavender. So with the right chemistry, cobalt will also make green or purple. So in the Art of Glaze Chemistry, you get an entire in-depth module on all the colorants and opacifiers with examples of different concentrations and how they can be influenced by glaze chemistry. And you'll get an assignment to do an experiment where you test the same base glaze with different fluxes and different colorants. And so these are test tiles by Lindsay Olson. And so here is her zinc base, her strontium base, and her calcium base. And then we've got copper, cobalt, iron, chrome, and rutile. And so you can see there's quite a different, like the blue, for example, with strontium and calcium, you get this navy blue. As soon as you switch to zinc, it's like much more vibrant, kind of an electric blue color when you're using zinc as your RO flux. So that can be very revealing. Chrome, for example, chrome sometimes turns green, sometimes turns brown, sometimes turns pink. So chrome plus zinc will often make pink. And so sometimes, we learn like copper makes green or turquoise, and then you don't even realize you can also make green with chrome, or you can make different, blue with copper. So there's lots of options out there. If you kind of know how to manipulate the chemistry of your base glaze, you can get lots of different interesting colors. So matte versus glossy. Which materials are responsible for whether your glaze will be matte or glossy? Okay. So matte and glossy surfaces are based on the relationship between silica and alumina, for the most part. There are other factors, but most simply, it's the relationship between silica and alumina in the UMF. So some of you may have seen the Stull chart. This chart is called the Stull chart or the Stull map. It was developed by R.T. Stull in 1912, where he just basically took the same fluxes and altered the silica and alumina levels to move around the map. So we've got silica on the x-axis and alumina on the y-axis. So based on the UMF of the glaze, you can create recipes that fall on different points on this graph by altering the silica and alumina levels. And then, so he created all these recipes, fired them, and then plotted where the matte glazes fell, where the glossy glazes fell, and he found these patterns. And so what we've got here is the matte region for Stull. So we have to remember that these were Stull's experiments with specific chemistry. He was firing Dacone 11. He didn't have boron in his glaze. So, you know, this isn't to be taken as like the be all end all. Every matte glaze is going to fall in the matte region. But it's just kind of an example of the patterns. And in the art of glaze chemistry, you'll do experiments that will take you from the left side of this chart to the right, and you'll see how a glaze moves from matte through the glossy. And then we've got the underfired section over here on the right. And so here's an example of some of the glazes I showed you earlier and where they fall on the Stull chart. So this black velvet matte glaze falls right here. And so it's kind of like on Stull's chart, it's in the semi-matte region. But what I found is that the regions kind of move around depending on what you're using as your fluxes, how much boron you have in the glaze, but the patterns stay the same. Matte glazes on the left, glossy glazes in the middle. And so we've got both of these matte glazes are over here on the left side, and then this clear and this green glossy glaze, they both fall right in the center of the glossy region. And so it's cool when you start learning this, you can go and enter all your glaze recipes into Glaze and then look at the UMF, and Glaze will plot your glaze recipe on the Stull chart, and you can see where it falls. And if it doesn't fall where you expect it to, then you have to kind of look at and see if you can understand why, you know, why is my glaze in the glossy region? Why is it matte? It could be matte because it's underfired. It could be matte because it contains titanium. So titanium, also rutile titanium, crystallizes during the cooling cycle, which can turn a glossy glaze matte in the glossy region. So there are nuances and reasons for why your glaze might not match these patterns, but those are all things that we can learn when we understand the chemistry. So here's an example of, I just did like the 0.5 alumina line, and I mix a glaze for this point, dipped a test tile, it's a matte glaze. I added some silica, dipped a test tile, it's still matte. And then I move into satin, and then glossy, 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 glossy. As the silica increases, eventually I have too much silica, which melts at a very high temperature for my fluxes. And then we enter the underfired region. So all of these ones are underfired because there's just, you know, my fluxes stay constant all over the map. But if we keep the fluxes the same and just continually increase silica, then we're going to end up, our glaze won't be able to melt at our temperature. We could fire it hotter and then it'll melt, but keeping everything constant, just increasing silica, eventually your glaze will be underfired. A common misconception is I can't fire my matte glaze hotter or it goes glossy. So this is one of the things that I had before I learned chemistry. I had these glazes that gave me such a hard time. They were very runny. Once they started melting, they contain a bunch of lithium. Once they started melting, they would just run onto the kiln shelves. And so it was very like, okay, I can't underfire them because they're glossy glazes. if they're under fired, they are matte. So this is like cone 5, this is cone 6. So if my kiln under fires, or one shelf of my kiln under fires, all of the glazes on that shelf, which was happening in my case, my kiln was very uneven. They were not fired hot enough to turn glossy. And so these are just under fired glossy glazes. I was like, I didn't know that at the time. I was like, oh, well, I just don't like how it looks when it's under fired. I wanted the shine, but I didn't know it was a problem. When your glaze is under fired, it means it hasn't melted and fused into a glass, and the glass is very strong. Under fired glazes are not very strong. They're not fully matured yet, and so they're vulnerable, to acids and bases and dishwashers and cutlery. So you really want your glaze to be well melted in order for it to be durable. So if you have a matte glaze that goes glossy when it's fired hotter, I would be looking at the chemistry of that glaze. Is it a true matte glaze? If it doesn't fall in the matte region of the stall chart, it could be that it's just an under fired glossy glaze, and then you might want to take a look at that. So in the Art of Glaze Chemistry, there's a whole module on silica, alumina, and the stall chart. And you'll do an experiment so you can see for yourself the progression from matte to glossy. And so here, these are by Sandra. So starting here, this has the lowest silica level, and then this is a matte glaze. She added a bit of cobalt for color. And so as she increases silica, it goes from matte into glossy, 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 and then it starts to become under fired. And you can see that this one here is definitely under fired, just kind of in the reflection. And so in AGC, I teach you all the exceptions to the rule of like, okay, my matte glaze doesn't fall in the matte region of the stall chart. Why? Like, is it bad? Is it okay? What are the other reasons for that? And so that is all covered in the Art of Glaze Chemistry. Number 4, melting temperature. Which materials can raise and lower a glaze's melting temperature? So I talked earlier about glass formers and fluxes. Silica and alumina are the glass formers. I didn't really talk about alumina being a glass former. So alumina melts at an even higher temperature than silica. So alumina melts at cone 42, silica melts at cone 32. So we add fluxes to bring down the melting temperature of silica and alumina to a temperature that our kilns will easily fire to, like cone 6, cone 10, cone 06, whatever you're firing to. Chances are your kiln will not reach like 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So we need fluxes. So just a reminder that when a glaze recipe is the whole pie, the whole circle. And then this little section here represents the fluxes. So we always have, ideally for durability, we want to have a big section of glass formers and then a smaller section of fluxes. We don't want to overflux the glaze because the glass formers are what make the glaze nice and durable, a strong glass. So now I take the glass formers and break them down into silica, alumina, and boron. So this again is my clear recipe that I'm representing here. And then the flux triangle can be divided into primary fluxes and secondary fluxes. So I can increase primary fluxes and the secondary fluxes will go down. I can increase the fluxes and the glass formers will go down. Everything is in relationship to each other, and chemistry is based on proportions of one element to another element. So this is just kind of foundational knowledge about how the system works, because it is a system. When we start changing things, it's just good to keep in mind that when one thing goes up, everything else comes down proportionately. So as far as temperature goes, here's an example of a cone 10 glaze where we've got glass formers, silica, and alumina. and then we've got fluxes. And so that's kind of similar to the pie I was showing you earlier, way more glass former than flux. And then for cone 6, cone 10 glazes don't require boron to melt at that temperature. Once we move to cone 6, now this orange section, that's the boron. So the fluxes kind of stay the same, but now we're replacing some of this silicon alumina, some of the high melting temperature glass formers with boron, which is a low melting temperature glass former. So we're just reducing the silicon alumina to give space to add a little boron in there to help the glaze melt at cone 6. And then at low fire, cone 04, for example, we have much more boron. So the fluxes are generally the same. They take up the same amount of space in the pie, but now our glass formers are divided up differently. So there's way more boron, way more low melting temperature glass former, and less silica and alumina. And that's so the glaze will melt at an even lower temperature. So it's all about proportions. So to lower a glaze's melting temperature, we either need to increase the flux, reducing the high melting temperature glass formers, or we need to increase the low melting temperature glass former, increase the boron, reducing the silica and alumina, or some variation of all of those things. So a common misconception is, my glaze runs at cone 6, so I just fire it to cone 5. Now, the reason why this is not really a good strategy is that your glaze firing temperature should always be based on the maturing temperature of your clay body. So you don't want to underfire your clay body, which means it won't be vitrified. So your clay body, as temperature goes up, when we bisque fire our clay body, it becomes very porous, which helps with the glazing process. And then as the temperature increases in the glaze firing, those pores get filled in with melted silica. Your pottery shrinks in the glaze firing. And we want our pots, especially at stoneware temperatures, porcelain, stoneware, cone 6 and above, we want vitrification. So we don't want to underfire our clay body just because our glaze is running at cone 6. It's better to fire your clay body to its maximum maturing temperature so that you can have a fully vitrified clay body, which means it's not absorbent. It can't absorb water. You take it out of the dishwasher and it's not like full of water, which can harbor bacteria. You put it in the microwave. Water turns to steam and expands and explodes. We want vitrified clay bodies. So we need to not adjust the firing temperature. We need to adjust the glaze melting temperature. And that's a way better strategy. So you keep your firing temperature based on the clay body you're working with. And then you find glazes that melt at that temperature, or you adjust with the knowledge of chemistry, you adjust your glazes so that they'll melt at the vitrification temperature of your clay body. So reasons why you might want to increase the melting temperature of your glaze. If your glaze is running or dripping, either by itself or in combination when you layer it with other glazes. Sometimes your glazes are fine by themselves, and then you layer them on top of each other and it becomes a runny mess. And so you could slightly increase the melting temperature of those glazes in order to reduce the amount of running, in which case I would probably just increase the silica and alumina, these high melting temperature glass formers, which proportionately lowers the fluxes, and that's a way you can increase melting temperature. Or if you're switching to a higher temperature clay body, you can increase melting temperature so that your glaze will melt at a higher temperature and it won't run all over the kiln shelves. Reasons why you might want to decrease your melting temperature if you determine your glaze is underfired. So maybe you have a matte glaze in the glossy region of Stull and there's no other reason why it should be matte, So you might want to lower the melting temperature because that glaze, if it's on functional pieces, you want your glaze to be completely melted, or find a new glaze. If you like the matte glaze, then just find a new matte recipe for that temperature. Sometimes you want your glaze to be more fluid so that it can run into other glazes like this. Like I would design these bowls with these little divots on top because I was using very runny glazes, and I really liked how the brown glaze ran into the turquoise. And so that's a reason why you might like your glazes to run as long as they stop before they hit the kiln shelf. Or you want your glaze to break over texture. So you might create a lot of texture in your pieces, and then you put a glaze on and it kind of just covers everything up. That's usually to do with the melted viscosity of your glaze in the kiln. And if you lower the melted viscosity by lowering the alumina level, then that will help you create a glaze that is more fluid and will sink into the low spots of the texture and really highlight the texture on your pieces. Or if you're switching to a lower temperature clay body, then you need to lower the melting temperature of your glazes. So just to recap, and so strategies, if we want to increase melting temperature, we can increase our high melting temperature glass formers, silica and alumina. So this is if we want to increase the melting temperature. We can decrease the boron because the boron is helping the glaze to melt at a lower temperature. So we lower the boron, which raises the melting temperature. Or we can decrease the primary flux, which raises the secondary flux, and that's also a way to increase melting temperature. If we want to lower the melting temperature, we just do the opposite. We can lower the silica and alumina, we can increase the boron, or we can increase the secondary flux, lowering the primary flux, and that will also lower the temperature that the glaze will melt at. So in the art of glaze chemistry, you'll learn how to adjust melting temperature in the best way, depending on your glaze goals, without compromising the appearance or the durability of your glaze. Because some of those strategies are better than others. It always depends on the recipe you're starting with. I'll give you specific strategies on, if your UMF looks like this and you want to increase or decrease, these are the steps you should take. And of course, you always need to test. This is one of my students, Jean Paul. She came into my class. She was really trying to create like this perfect drip. And so this was her first attempt. And so this was just like, there was just too much flux, too much boron, not enough, the glaze just melted onto the kiln shelves. And then throughout the course, she learned that she could adjust the drip and create like these nice fat drips that can be controlled by, we want to increase the melted viscosity of the glaze so it's not running all over the kiln shelves. So we want it to be well melted so it starts to drip, but not so. We want it to have a high viscosity when it starts dripping so that the drips are very slow. And so you do that by so she increased the boron and increased the alumina, and that gave the exact proportions of everything to give her the drips that she was really looking for. And our last point, oh my gosh, time. I'm going to talk really fast. I want lots of time for questions. So crazing, why do glazes craze and what can we do about it? So here's an example of a crazed or a crackle glaze. It's the result of a thermal expansion mismatch between your glaze and your clay body. And so when we put our pieces in the kiln, the glaze expands as it's heated and contracts as it's cooled. And then the clay body also expands as it's heated, contracts as it's cooled. And if they do that at the same rate, we have what's called glaze fit, and we won't get this crazing effect. If our glaze has higher thermal expansion than our clay body, that's when we end up with crazing. And so basically the clay body expands and contracts, the glaze expands and contracts and continues contracting after the clay body has stopped contracting. And this is not shrinkage. It's a contraction back to where it started. It expands and contracts back to where it started. And it continues to contract while the clay body is just sitting there, and it gets so super tight, the tension increases, and then all of these cracks form to relieve that tension. So misconceptions about crazing. Glazes craze because of shrinkage. I think people say this because they kind of intellectually understand the expansion and contraction, but it's not actually shrinkage. You know, how your clay body shrinks during the glaze firing. It's not actually that shrinkage that has an effect on thermal expansion and crazing. It's just the expansion and contraction, which is based on the materials that your glaze recipe is composed of. Another misconception, crazing is a result of opening the kiln too early. If you open the kiln too early, the crazing will happen faster than if you let the kiln cool very slowly. But the crazing will still happen regardless of when you open the kiln. So it might happen right away. It might happen the next day. It might happen a month later. So a lot of people say, oh, you opened your kiln too early. Your kiln was too hot when you opened it. That's why your glazes are crazing. That's not actually the case. If a clay body and a glaze don't have a match, a thermal expansion match, then the glaze will craze regardless of how slowly it is cooled and what temperature you open the kiln at. A lot of people say to fix crazing, you just add silica. Now, this can work in some cases, but as we learned with the stall chart, matte and glossy, if we add silica, if we just keep adding silica, eventually our glaze will be underfired. If we have a matte glaze on the left side of the stall chart and we add silica to fix crazing, we might end up with a glossy glaze. So adding silica, while it can in some cases reduce thermal expansion, it's definitely not a blanket solution. And there are other better ways to reduce thermal expansion aside from just adding silica, which of course I will teach you in the art of glaze chemistry. And then a lot of people think if your glaze is crazed, it's not food safe. That food safety has to do with the chemistry of the glaze and its ability to leach toxic materials into someone's food. That has nothing to do with thermal expansion and crazing. Crazing leaves cracks in the glaze that bacteria can enter, but if you wash your pots, the bacteria goes away. So if you use hot water and soap, it's no different than, if you were to not wash some piece, your wooden spoon very well, chances are bacteria will grow in that as well. The wooden spoon is still food safe. You just have to wash it sufficiently to kill any bacteria. So it's not ideal. Some people don't mind crazing. Some people want to avoid it at all costs. That's a personal opinion. That's totally up to you to decide. But a crazed glaze does not mean that it's going to leach toxic materials into someone's food. It just means that there's cracks in the surface of the glaze that stuff could potentially get stuck in. And so a lot of atmospheric firing, sodium has the highest thermal expansion of all of our materials. So a lot of soda fired pieces the glazes are crazed. And that's just one of the things that you get when you're using that type of firing method, and it's not really a big deal. So the Stahl chart and crazing, this gray region here is where Stahl found crazing on his clay body. And this region is not set in stone any more than anything else on this chart is. It can move around. It's just a pattern. And so if your glaze might be crazing and not in the crazing region because you're using a different clay body than Stahl was using, you're firing to a different temperature. But basically, if you find your glaze is crazing and it is in the lower region of the stall chart, then you can add silica and alumina. I recommend adding both silica and alumina, keeping the ratio the same, and you can just move out of the crazing region, and that will lower the thermal expansion of your glaze. So just, a lot of people tend to think that that if their glaze, they might have a glaze that's in the crazing region, but it's not crazing, and they want to fix it. But if it's not crazing, then it's perfectly fine. So just keep that in mind. The crazing region, that was based on Stull's experiment, and this region changes depending on the clay body you're using. But the general pattern stays the same. So if you're over here in crazing, you can get out of crazing by going this way. If you're down here, you can get out by going up. And so that's kind of the way to look at that. And so all of these dots represent these test tiles, and you can see my test results show crazing on the first three. So these three are crazing, and then these four, the four top ones are not. So in this case, my glazes are crazing in Stull's crazing region, and then they're not crazing as soon as I get out of his region. But I also have examples of where crazing can kind of happen over here. And it's based on the other materials that are in the glaze, not just the silica and alumina. So in the art of glaze chemistry, you'll get specific strategies for how to fix crazing depending on the chemistry of your glaze. You'll also get a whole list of oxides and their relative thermal expansion. So, the best way to reduce thermal expansion is you use material substitutions. You replace high thermal expansion materials with low thermal expansion materials, and that will lower the thermal expansion of your glaze, and hopefully it will fit your clay body better. Okay, so that is the class. Let me just do a quick recap. And we're gonna have, we'll have about half an hour for questions. So the 5 main components, we've got primary fluxes, secondary fluxes. We've got silica, alumina, and boron. Those are our glass formers. Silica and alumina melt at very high temperatures. Boron melts at a very low temperature. And we add fluxes and boron to our silica and alumina in order to get our glazes melting at the temperature that we're firing to. So we can do material substitutions to replace expensive materials with inexpensive materials, or if you live in Europe and you find a recipe from North America, you can replace materials to use your local materials and recreate the chemistry of the glaze. The glaze color response has to do with the chemistry of the base glaze that you're adding the color to, which color you choose, and then also the concentration of the colorant that you add to the recipe. Matte versus glossy is based on the relationship between silica and alumina, and the Stull chart really helps us to see where we can, how we can adapt our UMF, the unity molecular formula, to get our glaze into this region if we want a matte glaze, or over here if we want glossy glazes, and we try to stay away from this side where glazes are likely to be underfired. Melting temperature can be increased or decreased by either adding, we add more flux or we add boron to lower melting temperature, and we can add silica and alumina to increase melting temperature. So there's different ways to go about changing melting temperature, but basically we're replacing high melting temperature materials with low, or vice versa, depending on the direction that we want to take. And then finally, crazing is a relationship of the thermal expansion of your glaze with the thermal expansion of your clay body. And every clay body has a different thermal expansion. So you can have a glaze that crazes on one clay body, but not another. And so it's not the glaze, it's the relationship between the two. If your glaze is crazing and it is in this lower crazing region of the Stull chart, one way to reduce crazing is one test you can do no guarantees, but you can increase silica and alumina to move up and to the right, keeping the ratio of silica and alumina the same by way of UMF. And that is one simple way to try to reduce crazing. Okay, you're here today because you want more amazing glaze results. You're ready to start understanding glazes on a deeper level, and you realize you might need to learn a little bit of chemistry in order to get there. So some past student words about chemistry. This is Mary. She says, I was a good student, but didn't have much interest in science or chemistry when I was in school. Sue's guidance helped me to learn to apply chemistry in an organized way to achieve a desired outcome. I would tell another person to sign up without delay. Marguerite says, I took this course and it was fantastic. Sue is an amazing instructor. She makes everything very easy to understand, and I found chemistry fun to learn as opposed to school umpteen thousand years ago. And Christine says, I've so enjoyed your course. It was just what I needed and has given me so much more understanding about my glazes. I love the really clear way you explain the chemistry. I'm delighted you are taking time out to focus on developing more courses. Great to see you doing more of what you are so good at. So remember that the concepts that I shared with you today are not just theories that I read in a book and now I'm just repeating them back to you. I have done all this testing. I've done so much glaze testing, and I have learned so much. Like I was just telling some of my students yesterday that even I spent July and August testing glazes, and I even continue to learn. I am always learning. The more I unload the kiln, the more I test and experiment and unload those results, analyze the UMF, compare the UMF to the result that I get, the more I'm always learning. And so this is, coming from a lot of experience with glaze, mixing glazes, testing them, failing, succeeding, all of these things. So I just have a lot of experience to offer, and I can help you with your specific glaze. Working at the rec center for 6 years, like I unloaded thousands and thousands of pots, some very successful, some failures. And so I've just seen a lot of glaze results in my time. And so glaze chemistry is complicated, but the basis of it is simple. It's just doing the testing and not being in a hurry to get to the final result. Eventually you'll get there. There's a very systematic way you can go about testing in order to get to the results that you want. So you can create the pots that, represent what you are trying to put out into the world. And so something to consider is how much time you spend making your pots to fill your last kiln load. If you unload your kiln like I did and everything's failed, like that's just hours and hours of work that is just down the toilet. You take your hammer and you smash your pots. And so when you understand chemistry, you're really going to save a lot of time scratching your head, trying to figure out what went wrong. You'll still have some disappointment going forward, the more you try and experiment, but you'll know what to do in order to get to the result that you want. So now is your time to learn glaze chemistry so you can level up your understanding with my guidance and a step-by-step system, easy to follow explanations. So that's one of the comments I get all the time, is just the way hopefully you see today, I wasn't talking too fast, but just I try to break everything down into the simplest terms possible, and I don't leave anyone behind. I make sure all questions always get answered in all of my courses. And so I am there to help you. So I would love to invite you to join me in the Art of Glaze Chemistry course. Registration open today. The course is 8 modules that takes place over the next 10 weeks. So module 1 comes out on October 1st. Although if you sign up now, there's a bunch of prep that you can get started with and some videos you can watch, and you can start your learning right now as you wait for module 1 to be released. And so you can improve your glaze results using chemistry. Here's an example of one of my students from last year, Chris. He was getting a lot of bubbling with his glaze. And he was like, after he took the course, he was like, I'm going to try replacing whiting with wollastonite, because as you'll learn, whiting releases carbon dioxide gas during the firing. Wollastonite is calcium silicate. And so he was able to, decrease the clouding of his glaze. He's still getting some off-gassing on the dark clay body, but on the lighter clay body, the clouding produced by little microbubbles was decreased by just replacing whiting, whiting and silica with wollastonite, and that cleared the bubbles to give him a more clear result. So in this program, you get lifetime access to the 8 modules, and then there's plenty of resources, handouts, worksheets. There's a Glaze resource library that you'll get access to with a lot of supplemental information, so things that are kind of tangential to the course topic. So I give you lots of resources to kind of branch off and learn about what you're most interested in. We spend the whole course in glaze.org, and so there's lots of tutorials on how to use Glaze and some of the more advanced features of Glaze. And then, of course, you'll get step-by-step glaze testing assignments throughout the course. There are 4 experiments that you'll do. And so there is a bit of studio time. I always recommend you take the information and then you put it to the test by firing it in the kiln. And so by the end of the course, you'll have a very thorough understanding of the role of all of your glaze materials, and you'll have a collection of fired tests. When you can see and feel and touch your glaze samples, like seeing them on a screen is one thing, but when you can actually feel the difference between an under-fired matte glaze and a properly fired matte glaze, for example, that is what really helps you to solidify the knowledge in your brains. So here's the RO Flux Color Run from Massimo. So these are all calcium, magnesium, strontium, and zinc, and cobalt 1% on different clay bodies. And so that's one of the later experiments that we do once we learn about all the different fluxes. And then I also teach you how to design your own glaze testing experiments and how to develop your own glaze recipes from scratch. So by the end of the course, you're going to know how to okay, I want to make a cone 6 glossy green glaze, and you'll know how to just create that glaze instead of just finding a recipe online. So you'll have the skills to do your own glaze development, and then also just to take your existing recipes and tweak them, and so that they improve and you make them look more how you want them to. And here's the schedule, which you can see on the info page for the Art of Glaze Chemistry. But we do have 2 implementation weeks in order to give you time to do your glaze testing. So after module 3 and after module 6, there's just a week off where you don't get more assignments or more videos. So you just have a little time to catch up, absorb all the info, do some glaze testing before we move on. There's a Zoom call every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So today is Thursday, and this class started at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So it's at the same time that this class was taking place. The last Zoom happened on December the 7th. So well before Christmas holidays, we'll be all finished with this class, but not the learning. The learning happens forever. Here's just an overview of the modules. You can read about each module on the info page. It's Sue McLeod Ceramics .com/AGC, or the Art of Glaze Chemistry. Laura will post the link in the chat for that. And then, since we're going to be using glaze.org extensively, I give you all 2 free months of the Glaze patron membership, which just unlocks special features. So Glaze is free to use, but if you pay $2 a month, you get to unlock these features. And so I want everyone to have the same version of Glaze as we go through the course. So I give you 2 months of the Glaze patron membership, which unlocks these different features, which we're going to be using in the course. Bonus, as soon as you register, you'll get access to my What Do the Glaze Materials Do masterclass. So this is where you can start learning about the composition of your materials. What is nephsi made of? What is Gersley borate made of? So this is included in the Art of Glaze Chemistry. It's a workshop that I sell separately, but it's just a good way to kind of get an overview. But all of this information is covered in much more detail in the Art of Glaze Chemistry. And then we have a student community on Facebook where you can ask questions any day of the week. I make sure every question gets answered in this class. So don't worry, don't think that you're going to come and today on this class, I can't answer every single question, but if you join my program, I always make sure that everyone is supported and you'll get answers to all of your questions, either in the Facebook group. There is a place that's not on Facebook that you can ask questions as well, and then in the weekly Zoom calls. And you can pre-submit questions. So if you can't make the weekly Zoom calls, there's a Google form that you can fill out to submit questions. I always start with the pre-submitted questions at the beginning of the call. So that's a way to guarantee that your question gets answered on the Zoom call. So please, I hope some of you will join the Art of Glaze Chemistry so you can learn to make your glazes more amazing. And what is the investment? So just before I tell you the price, just thinking about the retail value of your next kiln load, is it worth $500 or $3,000 or $5,000? That kiln load that I unloaded with all those teapots, it would have been worth well over $1,000, and I just had to throw it all away. And so when you understand glaze chemistry, you're going to save time and money. So just keeping that in mind. The course is $597 US, and that's for lifetime access. So you never lose access. You can go back, watch the videos over and over again. And then I also offer a payment plan, which is 3 payments of $215. So a total of $645. That's all in US dollars, of course. And so if 600 is too much for you right now, you can just pay $215 today, and then another payment in a month and another payment in a month. So trying to make it accessible for everyone, because this information really is invaluable and it's going to help you with your entire ceramics career. This is just what the checkout page looks like. So just so you know, when you end up on this page, you'll select either one-time payment or you can split it into 3 payments. I accept PayPal or credit cards. Please make sure your email address is entered correctly. So there's no verification. So sometimes people will enter their email address wrong and then they don't get access to anything. So if that happens, just email me and we'll get it fixed. And so some other words from past students. Kathy says, Sue's able to think like a beginner. She lays a solid foundation on which to build. Very organized in her teaching, well worth the money. And Joan, again, she said, Sue is an amazing teacher. The course delivery worked well for me. I also love that I have lifetime access to everything and can go back and review anytime I need to. So here is the page that you go to register, SueMcLeodCeramics.com/AGC. And if you feel that you're not ready to take this step, this was a lot of information today, and I acknowledge that it can get very complicated. But when you take the whole course, I take it very, very slowly. I break things down and explain everything very well. so as not to leave you behind. So it doesn't fly by in 2 hours. It's over 10 weeks. There's lots of time to learn. But that doesn't mean that this course is ready. Everyone would be ready to take this class. One of the requirements is that you already know how to mix your own glazes from scratch. So if you don't know how to do that, it'll make the assignments more difficult. And so that's a skill that you need to have coming into this program. I don't teach glaze mixing in this class, but I do teach you how to experiment. And so I do teach a class called Glaze Mixing Essentials if you want to start by learning how to mix glazes from scratch. And there is a coupon for the month of September to take $30 off of the price of this course. And so you'll see that coupon code when you go to the sales page. You can just go to this page and there will be a banner on the top telling you that there's a coupon. And so you can choose to do that, or you could start with this. This is a $57 workshop just to learn about the composition of your glaze materials. Okay. Yay, we made it to the Q&A session at the end. So I'm going to take a deep breath and a glass of water, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you. I see there are 81 questions, so just to let you know now, I'm probably not going to be able to answer all of your questions, but I'm going to answer as many as I can. So without further ado. Okay. So many questions. And just to let you know as well, if your question doesn't get answered, I have a free Facebook group. I think a lot of you are probably in it. It's called Understanding Glazes with Sue, and you can go post your question in there, and you'll get lots of help in there as well. So I'm going to answer as many questions as I can here today. Okay, so Pauline says, can ferrofrit 3134 be used as a direct substitute for Gersley borate? That's a very good question, because Frit 3134 contains boron, which is what Gersley borate contains. Frit 3134 also contains calcium, also available in Gersley borate. And then, they contain the same materials, but they're in slightly different proportions. So you can't really take a glaze with Gersley borate, say it has 10% Gersley borate, and just substitute Frit 3134 and expect to get the same result. So what you can do is do the substitution. So use glaze calculation software, use glazy.org, do the substitution with 3134, and then you go back and you see, okay, the boron is a little bit low. So what you would do first is, if the boron is low, if it's high, you'll lower the Frit to bring it down to the same level as the Gersley borate. If it's low, you'll increase the Frit until the boron levels match. And then you're looking for, okay, what else is on the low side, because you're always adding to the glaze. So say it's low in sodium, then you need to add something that contains sodium. So you could add Minspire, you could add Nefsi. So they're not a one-to-one substitution, but it is a good material to use instead of Gersley borate. It's just that you'll have to do some more tweaking once you get it in there in order to get the UMFs to match. Okay. Beth says, I use Sue's white and Sue's clear. The clear goes on quite well, but the white is super powdery and makes it almost impossible to layer another glaze on top. I lowered my bisque to 07, hoping the pot can pull in bigger particles, but I'm not sure why this is happening. Yeah, so a powdery glaze usually means that the clay content in the glaze is on the low side. So I can't remember right now what the clay percentage is. It's probably EPK, that is the source of the clay in this recipe. And so when your glaze is very powdery, what clay does is it binds all the materials together. It kind of acts like a glue. The plasticity of clay, you know, how clay sticks to itself, that helps to bind all the glaze, you know, the powdered glaze materials together as well in the glazing process. So if your glaze is super powdery, one thing you can add instead of altering the entire recipe is you can add some bentonite. So it could be that you need to add 1 to 2% bentonite, and that is really going to help to bind all the particles together. So that is the first thing. Without seeing the recipe in front of me, that's the first thing that I would try. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to find questions that are the most relevant to the class that I just taught today. So forgive me if I don't answer your question. Let's see. I have, Bridget says, I have buckets of glaze that were matte at cone 5. I am now firing to cone 6 and they are glossy. What can I add to this prepared glaze to return it to matte at cone 6? So you may have to go back and review the part about matte and glossy. This question was asked before I covered that part. But if you want your glossy glaze to be matte, then you need to reduce the silica to alumina ratio. And so you're reducing the silica in the glaze to move it from the left to the right to the left on the stall chart into the matte region. Now, that's not always a possibility. It requires that your glaze has silica as an ingredient so that you can reduce the percentage of silica. But that's the first thing that I would look for. I would look at where it falls on the stall chart, and then I would see if I can reduce the silica enough so that the silica to alumina ratio in the UMF is around 5 to 1. Around 5 to 1. And that will hopefully produce a matte result. Not always possible with every recipe. That's the first thing I would try. Let's see. Okay, Jody says, when you did the substitutions in the beginning, it did not add up to 100%. I believe it was 97.5. Is that a problem? Yeah, so it's not a problem because everything is in proportion to each other. And so oftentimes when I'm doing material substitutions, I don't pay attention to the percentage, like the total percentage, until I get the UMFs to match. And then the last step in glazy.org, there's a 100% button. And so I probably didn't do that step for this presentation, but that's what I would do. So once I get the 2 UMFs to match, I just hit the 100% button, and then that adjusts all the percentages. So it would increase them all slightly so that the new total is 100. That's called normalizing the recipe to 100%. You don't have to normalize it to 100. You could leave it at 97.5. Sometimes I will leave my recipe not adding up to 100 if I want to remember that I made changes to the recipe. I know that if my recipes don't add up to 100, it means I started with a recipe that added to 100, and then I made changes to it. And that just helps me to remember that. But at any point, I could just hit the 100% button, and it would just change all the percentages so that they add to 100. Let's see. Elizabeth says, do you offer this course in the spring? Yes. So this course, the Art of Glaze Chemistry, will be offered again next year. Yeah, in the spring sometime, March or April probably is when it'll start. Yeah, and so spring and fall, so far, that seems to be what I'm doing every year. Elizabeth also says, how many different kinds of materials do you keep on hand in your studio to mix your own glazes? So I like to have all the materials, but you don't need to have all the materials. So, you know, the best advice, I have a shopping list. If you go to my blog and you just type in shopping list, you'll find an article about if I was just going to start with a very small, minimal list of materials, these are the ones I would buy because they are the most versatile and can be substituted for each other. And they're giving you, sources of primary flux, sources of secondary flux, a couple colorants, some boron. And so that's like the bare minimum of what I would buy if I was just starting out, or if my space was limited, or if I was on a budget. And so you could just find a recipe you want to make and just buy those materials. Since I don't live somewhere where I can just drive to the store and buy materials, I have to have them shipped to me. I always want to order more than I know I'm going to need right away, just in case for the future. But then I found the more I learned about chemistry, it was like, ooh, I don't have that material. I want to try that, zinc, or some of the more expensive materials didn't make the list. But then you start to want to explore and experiment, and then you can always add to your inventory. And then Elizabeth asks, third question, how much time do you allow to complete, or would you allow to complete the modules? So each video, each module has a video lesson that's about 2 hours long, more or less. Sometimes there's an experiment with a module that has another video where I explain how to do the experiment. You get a PDF printout as well. And so I would allow for 2 to 4 hours of video watching time. And then in modules 1, 2, 4, and 6, there are glaze testing assignments, each of which will require a few hours in your studio. Plus, to prepare for the course, you need to make test tiles. I recommend at least 50 test tiles of each clay body that you want to test glazes on. So if you have a dark and a light clay body, you want to make 50 test tiles of each, so you can dip each glaze in onto both clay bodies and then just compare the results. And so a bit of time leading up to the course to make and bisque fire some test tiles. Let's see. A lot of people are asking about food safety. That's a very complicated subject that I cover to the best. It's hard to tell you what makes a glaze food safe. There's so many factors that go into food safety. It depends on the materials you're using, and as well as the chemistry of the glaze. So I cover that in the course. It's just too much information for me to really get into here. But in the course, I talk about the difference between food safety and durability. So you can have a glaze that is food safe, but not very durable, meaning that your glossy glaze goes in the dishwasher 100 times and it becomes dull and matte and etched. That's not a very durable glaze. And so there's a difference between the two, and we talk about the chemistry of durable glazes a lot more than we talk about food safety, because food safety is more based on what you're putting into your glaze and the materials. Are those materials potentially toxic to a person? If they're not, if your glaze is composed of materials that are not potentially toxic, then your glaze is automatically food safe, but it might not be durable, which is another consideration. So I cover that in great detail to the best of my ability without sending our glazes off to labs to be tested. I cover that in the Art of Glaze Chemistry. Okay. So Janice says, how do you know when something is underfired? It's hard to tell. So the first thing I would do, generally an underfired glaze, sometimes if you have a drip, so all of my test tiles, they tend to have a drip on the same corner. So the way I pull them out and shake them off, they always get a drip on one corner. And that drip, I leave it there. I don't like chisel it off or smooth it out. I leave it there. And when I get my fired test tiles out of the kiln, if that drip is a bump or it looks like it hasn't melted yet, that's a sure indication that your glaze is under fired. A drip should melt completely and smooth in with the rest. You might see like a different like opacity difference because the glaze is a little bit thicker in that spot, but you shouldn't really have a bump left. So that's one way you can tell. Another way is I would plot the glaze on the stall chart. If it's matte and it falls in the glossy region, that is a way, like that's an indication that it could be under fired. The way to test that, if you think your glaze is under fired, you could just add silica to it, because if it's under fired already and you add silica that melts at a very high temperature to an under fired glaze, it will be more under fired. So it'll get drier and rougher. Whereas if your glaze is a matte glaze, a melted matte glaze, and you add silica to it, it's going to go glossy. So that's one way to test if your glaze is under fired at your temperature. You can look for unmelted drips, or if it's less obvious than that, you can just add silica. If it goes from being matte to glossy, then your matte glaze wasn't under fired. If it goes from being matte to more matte, then your glaze was under fired. So that's a good way to check. Let's see, scrolling. I'm trying to get a range of questions here. Let's see. Missy says, where can we find the UMF for the various materials? I found some in Glaze, but not comprehensive. So Glaze, when you're in Glaze, if you click community on the top of the screen and then materials, you can type in any material and they will show up and you can see the UMF. You can switch it so that it shows you the, like there's different ways at looking at the composition of a material. You can look at the weight percent of all of the oxides, or you can see the UMF of all of the oxides. So that's one way. The other resource that is great is digitalfire.com. That's a website, very, very helpful website. And that's usually where I go when I'm looking at materials information, because not only does he give the composition of the material, but he has like a blog post for every single material with descriptions and what it's most used for and things to consider. So that's digitalfire.com. The site was created by Tony Hansen. He works for Plainsman Clay. Really, really great resource. So that either glazy.org, click on community and then materials, or go to digitalfire.com. Okay, we have just 6 minutes left. Okay, Sebastian says, thank you for this session. You're a great teacher. Thank you. Is your course adapted for someone who fires at cone 9? Yeah, so you can take my course at any firing temperature. I teach you how to switch between firing temperatures. Every assignment that I give you has an example for a low fire glaze, a cone 6 glaze, and a cone 10 glaze. So the experiments, you can bring your own recipes at your temperature and do experiments with those, but I also provide examples if you don't have recipes that you're working with. I give an example for every range of temperature. So the course will just teach you the fluidity of temperature, and it's not like cone 6, cone 10, like there's just a way we can move between temperatures, and all of that is covered. So you can take this course regardless of what cone temperature you're firing to. Okay, Tasso says, since the stall chart is based on cone 11, how does it relate to lower cone glazes like 5 or 6? So the presentation that I gave at the NCECA conference in 2018, I talked about it at the very beginning. I recreated Stahl's chart at cone 6 by just adding boron to all the recipes. So I just added 0.15 moles of boron to every point on the chart, and I created a glaze recipe for each point on the graph. I did it at 2 different flux ratios, and I fired, over 100 test tiles, and that was prove to me that the stall chart works at cone 6. You just need boron to get your glazes melting at cone 6, but the matte, the matte region was on the left and the glossy in the center and underfired in the lower right corner. All of the patterns stayed the same, but the hard lines on Stahl's graph, they kind of moved left or right a little bit. And if you want to see all of those tests that I did on the Stahl chart at cone 6, if you go to my my presentation, you can watch the video or you can read through the whole thing. That's at my website, SueMcLeodCeramics.com /blog, and just type in understanding cone 6 and you'll find the blog post where you can see that video and just see how the Stahl chart relates at cone 6. Okay, see if I can answer. I'm going to scroll all the way down to get some different questions before we wrap up here today. Daniela says, if I develop a glaze, how do I know which cone to fire? I know the more boron is decreasing the temperature, but is it cone 5 or cone 6? So basically, you're choosing your firing temperature based on your clay body. And then you create a glaze recipe based on the criteria that I'll provide in the course. So for cone 6, it's like your boron level should be about this, your silica and alumina levels. I give parameters for each of the general firing temperatures, but then you throw it in the kiln, fire it. And at that point, you can see, okay, did it run? If it ran, then you can tweak the recipe to increase the melting temperature a little bit. So you're not changing your firing temperature. You learn how to adjust the glaze recipe so it'll match your firing temperature. So if it's a little bit stiff or underfired, you can lower the melting temperature slightly, or you can raise the melting temperature slightly based on the result you get out of the kiln. So you just test something, see what happens, and then you make adjustments to improve until you get what you want. I see, ignore my question. I didn't see, let's see. Carol says, is bentonite for glazes the same as what is used for wine making? I don't know much about wine making, but bentonite is a type of clay that is used in other industries, not just ceramics. So I would assume that it's the same. If it's just pure bentonite, it should be like a tan powder. I would assume, but I can't tell you for sure because I don't really know anything about making wine. But I would guess that it's the same. Like sometimes bentonite is used in skincare products, and that is the same, unless there's like maybe some fragrances added or something, but it still should work exactly the same. Let's see. One more question. Sarah says, some recipes are listed in grams and others in percentages. Is there a difference? So the way it works basically is a glaze recipe, the percentages are what determine the chemistry of the recipe. So ideally, we would take a glaze that adds up to 100, and then we would batch it out, so 100%, and then we would batch it out into grams. So if we wanted to make 1,000 grams of a glaze, then we would multiply all the percentages by 10. So we're taking 100%, which could represent 100 grams, and we multiply everything by 10, and that gives us 1,000 grams. And that's how much we weigh and put into the bucket when we're mixing glazes. So percentages are converted into grams by just multiplying, depending on the size of batch you want to make. So if you want to make a 5,000 gram batch, you would multiply every percentage by 50, and that would turn 100. So 100 times 50 is 5,000. And so that would give you a 5,000 gram batch of glaze. Okay, so There are 100 questions, and I'm very sorry that I didn't get a chance to answer all of them. But again, I want to remind you that Understanding Glazes with Sue Facebook group is a great place to go and post your questions. And I'll be checking in there, over the next week, just to see if any of you guys have questions from this class today. And I'm happy to answer them over there. My voice is kind of drying up, so I do have to let you all go now. But thank you all so much for coming to this class. I hope you learned a lot. I'm sure you still have questions, but just know, learning glaze chemistry is, it's really a lifelong journey. You just start taking in bits of information now. The most important thing is that you apply what you learned, test things. Always put test tiles in every firing, put at least one test tile in every firing that you do going forward, just to get that information out. So you can see, okay, this is what I made, this is how it looks, and then you're connecting the dots. And so whether or not you join me in the Art of Glaze Chemistry this time around, I just hope that you can start to take the little bits and pieces that you learned today and apply them and start playing around with glazy.org and the UMF and everything, and just start to put this information to use. And then, of course, if you have questions, then please take them to the Facebook group. There's 27,000 people in there. There's lots of really helpful people that are just waiting for your question so that they can help you answer it. So that's a really great resource again. And this replay, so Zoom will take some time to process the video. And as soon as it's ready, so in a couple of hours, watch your email and I'll send you a link to watch the replay of this class. It'll be available to watch until September the 29th only. So don't hesitate. Make sure you watch it before that date because it'll be taken down. So just know that there is a time limit to watch the replay, but you'll have 8 days or so to watch it. So thank you again, and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.